Start with a Zen parable following on from the last talk. And there was something when I did a little bit of meditation, and there's this story about a farmer. And the farmer gets a horse, and all his neighbours say, "Oh, you're so lucky." And he goes, "Maybe." The next day the horse runs away, and they say, "Oh, you poor thing." He goes, "Maybe." The next day the horse comes back with 3 wild horses, and his son rides on one of the wild horses, falls off, breaks his leg. And the neighbours go, "Oh, that's terrible." And he says, "Maybe." Next day the military come, and they're drafting for a war, and they walk past his son because he's got a broken leg. And they say, "You're lucky." And he says, "Maybe." And so I hadn't actually thought about that for ages. And it's interesting that it needs something desperately wrong has to happen in our life, it seems, in order to make us stop and go, where am I? And it's not until you have to hide your ego or you have to squash everything that you can actually look at who you are, what you want to be. And as you grow up, you get responsibilities, you get mortgages, you have children, and all of those things narrow your perception of where you should be. And it's not until it gets tipped upside down that you actually go, all right, where? And so I've recently had that happen. And so what's been interesting was I'm trying to understand how do you find where you are again? And so it's about peeling back the layers of the onion. And so basically, I've used myself as a case study because it's much easier. You don't know me, I don't know you, so we can just go through this little journey and see where it ends up, because I don't know. So maybe at dinner someone can give me some good advice on that one. I started out caravan park kid, no father. Sounded like paper bag in the middle of the road, you know, lived in a tent and then a caravan, community services, the whole bit. Lived with my nan, and then my mum met my dad, and we lived in a tent, and they had 12 quid apparently. And then with no money in England, poverty's poverty. And so they then got this opportunity, which doesn't really seem like an opportunity, to go and work in war-torn Africa. Because they just finished the civil war, but they were giving lots of money for anyone that was stupid enough to go and do it. So mum and dad said, yeah, rightio. So I'm dragged off to Zambia from a small coastal town in England. But it was just magnificent. There was just this freedom and swimming and sailing and riding bikes, and it was just fantastic. But then we had to come back to BUDE because it got too dangerous and it started getting messy again. And I didn't quite get BUDE. It was little, it was tiny, and I'd been used to this sort of freedom of Africa and no one sort of expecting anything of anyone. And then I've come back to, hello, where are you then? All these little Cornish people, just thinking, Jesus, what do I do? And so my dad bought me a surfboard, so I started surfing and dressing up like a French prostitute. But it was lovely. And there was a really, there was a beautiful time there. And then mum and dad, again, poverty's poverty, it's winter. They still hadn't got out of that. So let's go to Australia. And let's go to Brisbane, which was a shithole. And so here's the Commonwealth Games card ensuring the beauty of Brisbane, 1982. We have a freeway and a really dirty river. And so I had to go to a school called Corinda High School, and I had hairy legs. And all I can say is when your dresses are up here, it's not a good look. And so, again, sport was the answer. And there was a really good swim teacher there. So every morning at 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, I'd swim. In the afternoon, I'd swim. So I actually got to become quite a good swimmer. And that swimming helped me then. My parents had said, right, we're staying in Australia. I said, I'm not, I hate it. They said, well, you have to. And I said, no, I'm divorcing you. But I was only sort of 15, 16. And so I had to get through school. So I applied for every single scholarship I could find, which isn't easy when you don't have the web. And I ended up like in this 1490s castle in Llantwit Major in Wales. And there's this United World College, which does the International Baccalaureate, full of very, very, very rich people. But because I'd been in quite a few countries, that ticked the travel box. Because I'd done quite a few O-levels, because I'd had to go backwards and forwards, and because I was the English Ironwoman champion, which is like being the Ethiopian swim champion, it's not fantastic. I got picked up by the housemaster, was called Mr. Belcher, and they had a big Iron Woman, like a surf club team, and they'd never won anything. So I got this scholarship worth lots and lots of money. But the beautiful thing with it was we had Alex von Orange, who's the Prince of King of Holland. He was there. We had to go and meet the Prince of Wales and get drunk on his elderflower wine. But because there was 10 of us that had scholarships, and there was people at the end of the semester that would get picked up by helicopters, but you still felt rich, not because you were rich, but because you were one of 10. So elitism and rich isn't to do with money, which is a really lovely lesson to learn. So going back through my history, this was a nice one to remember. Okay, doesn't matter. Pay the mortgage, move on. So then I was in a pretty good place, and I thought, okay, right, got into Sussex Uni to study literature. And then my nan got leukemia, and 6 hours later was dead, which was fairly major because I'd lived with her more than my mum. My first boyfriend had diabetes, and we were at his house, and he's a baker, so he left. We were still sitting around, and he was downstairs, gone to bed early, and he killed himself in the middle of the night by accident, having a spasm. And then, I'm not shaky because that's hurting me, I'm shaky because I'm still nervous. And then I got a letter from the Australian government saying, because your parents because you're over 18, you can't be a resident of Australia. And I went, oh, that's okay, I'm staying in England. Then the English government said, because your parents have been paying taxes since you were 14, you can't be a student here. So I'm going, right, okay, I don't belong anywhere. I've divorced my parents, what do I do? And so I went, right, I'll go to France. I've not been there before. So I went to France, and I worked in a holiday camp that looked after troubled kids, which seemed like a good idea. And I met a friend, there was Dominic and Peter, and we looked after a group of people. And one night we were having a disco, and Dominic was dressed up like a 1920s swimmer, and I painted all blusher on him. And he's standing up like this, and I've passed him a cord, and he got electrocuted. He's got thrown up into the air and landed on the ground. And just went, wow, okay, now what? I thought, I don't know. So I went back to Australia, and I grabbed sport, because sport was what I could do. And then this was like a really big wake-up call, because I guess I was grabbing onto my ego, because that's what, you've won trophies. But then this thing came in the paper, pert 18-year-old Hannah Cutts, England's other Iron Lady, is loving it here because Margaret Thatcher is in power. Then it goes on to say that despite it only being a small group of 40, she didn't mind coming last. I just thought, oh, okay, well, that's not going to work. So then I went surfing. Okay, back to surfing. And so that's me catching a nice wave. Actually, it dumps, but it looks good there. Surfing, and then looking outside. Then, because you're not inside, and childhood had to be let go, it had to move on. And so it was about, okay, what's around me? And so for the first time looking and going, what's this? Joe Bielka-Peterson, it was interesting. Fighting for there to be free education. And everyone saying, oh, no, we're not going to march. It's only $250. But they're happy now. But I still didn't quite like it there. I tried architecture, didn't work, so I went back to London. And this time I had no ego. I didn't know where I came from. And so it was really lovely, sort of joyous freedom to go, come on then, give it a go. And so anything that came up, I'd go in and convince them, take me. So there was a job at Ted Baker to work in the shop. And I said, can I have the job? I wouldn't be any good in the shop, but just, I don't know, pay me and I'll just come up with stuff. And he went, all right. And so my job was, I'd get a model for the day, and we'd go and get drunk around London wearing Ted Baker stuff and take photos. It was such good fun. But then it got cold, and so went back to Australia, and I did a degree. And I thought I should do a degree. Quickest degree I could do was illustration, so I thought, right, illustrating. And so I could actually illustrate. Hadn't really done it much before, but the unfortunate thing with illustrating is you get paid per book. And so if you draw every hair on the lion, you don't get paid very much. So it wasn't a sustainable career. So I got an LC575, 1995, $5,000, and I started becoming a designer. I didn't really know much about design, but humour was a big part. And it was something that you'd go, if people laugh, if you can make people laugh and enjoy it, that's communicating. And I didn't know anything about the advertising industry, but I did know that I liked beer and music, and if I did stuff for people, they'd pay me with beer and music, and then it worked. And so everything seemed to have penises in it, unfortunately, early on. Well, they did hit their logo had a banana, so. And then from there, that was working with a music festival. And that then grew to the music festival sponsored with beer companies, and so then it's moved on to branding. By this stage, it's a bit sensible now. I've got staff, there's maybe 5 or 6 staff. And so we designed the Bee's Knees. So it's a big company doing Foster's, but we were still making the font out of the things that you stamp the back of the envelopes and sitting there and all painting. And it's kind of nice. They're still using this 10 years on, and it was us being silly in the back of the... Anyway, we got bigger clients, but they were still happy to use humour. So that's my father-in-law dressed up being a... He's like that. Wine labels, when we were working for Queensland Government doing their festivals, and again, still using artists to sell the stuff, even to a big... So that was a huge 12-metre billboard with this beautiful big piece of art on it, instead of having to use poxy pictures of fireworks, which is what they wanted. We then had to move into bigger clients. By now there's like 10 staff. And so that's a lot of wages. So you've got to take the bigger clients and the bigger work. But we'd still, all of the logo work that we did would still have a little bit of mucking about in there, a bit of play, a bit of humour. And then we got more work with restaurants. I downsized quite a fair bit and got more work with restaurants. And so it was then going back to this stuff. So it's the euro, and I found these old cigarette cards and then changed it all around. So she's got a bottle of wine up her skirt and he's playing a ham, as he would. This is another one for the laneway. So we've got it's laneway, so we've got all different traffic signs, and it actually says give head and slippery when wet and rack up, and they didn't realise until this huge thing's put in, and then one of the builders has gone, says give head. And it's going, but they got heaps of media, so that worked. That moves on to, this is Darth and Roger. And so one of the things in the office we used to do to try and make there be a bit of fun is, like, if someone had an idea, you'd just go with it. And this was unfortunately my idea. And so Darth and Roger travel around the world. And they like climbing things, and they make poignant witticisms. So he's saying in this one here, it is an unfathomable truth that the Japanese community seems happy to work within gently requested rulings. One small no parking sign has succeeded in clearing the street from any automobile. And so they climb things, but they also discuss, society, architecture, which is a nice, sensible aside. They've got a website. And so that then moves on, I guess, into me having to stop and go back through life and look and then come back. It's like, why do I have all this stuff? And so I started collating everything thanks to Instagram. And so I realised that I've probably got an issue in that I hoard. But now it's not hoarding because I've collated it, so it's curating. And so I have collections of collections. So there's bottles and stamps and bicycle seats and vintage arrows and signs. Just stacks. And then there's boxes that have got the big things in, and then there's small boxes, and those small boxes have all the things written on here. So this box, for example, has all that in, which looks like that. But if you open up that, it's got fly fishing things in it, and if you then go into that, it's that. So it's just treasure. And not quite sure really but it's there. And so I guess I was sort of going, what do I do with all of this? I have to justify it, sort of. And so art I've been collecting for years too, and there's too much of that. It's in every family's, all of my family's household, everywhere. And so I thought, art, okay, I collect things and I like art. How about I make art out of the things that I collect? And so I started a system called Look What I Found, which is where, look what I found. And so things that I've collected, I turn into art. And the first exhibition was in a nice posh gallery in Brisbane and nearly sold out, so it was fantastic. And I went, great, this works, so let's amp it up a bit. And so then the next one was called Look What I Found, Manila. And so I went around the back streets of Manila finding signs. That's Tubero. There, it's a plumber, but it's also a prostitute. It depends. If it's got their name on it, it's a prostitute. If it's got their phone number and no name, it's actually a plumber. And so collecting those, collecting letters, finding some old sign writers and then getting them to commissioning them to do me a whole series of dogs attacking different security guards and showing different sorts of underpants. I know. I had a translator to help me. I didn't ask him to do the underpants. He was just doing it. But it's such nice art. And so then after I've gone, okay, well, I've worked out the collections of collections. Now what else have I got here? So I've gone, right, journals. Okay, heaps of journals, bucket loads of journals. What do I do with that? Reading through them has been interesting. And so I started a poetry blog because I think that's the uncoolest thing you could possibly do. So I write poetry. And I have it so I can embarrass my children later. You've got a poetry blog. No. And so that's poetry. The next habit is I really like colour and silk and jewellery. And so I've got lots of it. So I was thinking, what do I do with that? So I've started this one I'm wearing today and that one I was wearing yesterday. So I've started designing silk, and I found a silk printer. I don't know what I'm going to do with that, but I was having a discussion with someone last night who suggested I make underpants, boxer shorts for men, perhaps. And that's got me excited, although I don't know how that joins up with anything. So then we've started with family, because I've had to look, then gone through a design career, which is bizarre, and still doesn't have any endings. It's got lots of little bits going like this. And then this cataclysmic, I can't say the word too hard, but you know what I mean, happened, and I've had to stop and look at family. And the family are growing up, and they're at the age where you're starting to look back, and there's me and there's them at the same age, and go, hang on, what do I do? It's not, I've found me, but where does this all sit in? And I remember being that age, and so we moved to the coast. I had to downsize everything, and it was about let's make them happy. Not just to make me happy, and it's a beautiful thing to watch. And there they are with a lovely banner, riding bikes through the mud. It's lovely. We live right on the beach. And so I'm thinking, okay, I've got my collections curated, I've got my family in order, I've got my design thing still happening, I'm lecturing, which means I do actually earn money. And then husband didn't die, but after 23 years has decided that perhaps it's time that we move on. And you go, oh, shit. And this was like 2 months ago. Normally you just argue, but you haven't. You've got children and you've got all this stuff, so you have to stop and think, what do I do? Which is where you have to let go of your ego, because you have to go, this can dissolve, and maybe actually it's a good thing. Let's work it out, but it's not about me. It's about where do I come into this whole thing and to find the joy that was there. And so this whole journey has been about trying to find that. Not because he's left me, not because of anything like that, just because we should all do that. But it's hard to do. And so I'm going to leave you with a poem, just because we talked about poetry, by E. Cummings, which is a really, really beautiful poem. Because you take life in your stride, instead of scheming how to beat the noblest game a man can proudly lose, or playing dead and hoping death himself will do the same. Because you aren't afraid to kiss the dirt and consequently dare to climb the sky. Because a mind no other mind should try to fool has always failed to fool your heart. But most without the smallest doubt, because no best is quite so good you don't conceive a better. And because no evil is so worse than worst, you fall in hate with love. Human one, mortally, immortal I can turn immense all times because to why.